we go. Okay, so we're going to be talking about closing equity gaps. And to start with, we probably should define, well, actually, there's the slides, but I put that link in the chat already. But this will be here if anyone wants to watch the video, wants to get access to the slides later. So the question is, which equity gaps? And the ones we're talking about primarily are those associated with race and ethnicity, with gender, with income, and first gen status. And these are the things that we observe most often in terms of differences in drop, fail, and withdrawal rates from classes, persistence rates, grade differentials, and so forth.
Yeah, I'll just add that, obviously, there are other identities that, we might be interested in, and, ways that we might define each of these. So often at our university, we use, and I think probably other universities as well, use Pell status to represent income
and we do have first gen status, and we do break it down by race and ethnicity.
Yeah.
And by gender. There are many other potential ones, as Maggie said, but these are the ones that tend to be recorded and studied the most. So those are the ones that we've been focusing on, because that's what tends to show up in most of the studies that have been done.
Yeah.
And this is the most recent data we could find. But if you look at rates of graduation within 150% of program time, 6-year graduation rates, basically. This is the most recent data that we could find on the National Center for Educational Statistics, or at least most recent data that's already organized into a nice diagram. Mm-hmm. And what we observe is that American Indian, Alaska Natives, Indigenous people have the lowest completion rates, and Asian individuals have the highest, and everyone else is in between. But we do notice in particular that Black and Hispanic graduation rates are significantly lower. Completion rates within 6 years are significantly lower, dramatically lower than they are for white and Asian individuals. And for people who identify with 2 or more races, it's also somewhere in between.
I guess I'll just add that, this is a conversation that, has been extensively discussed on our campus, on campuses across the country, on how do we ensure that we are leveling the playing field for our students who are coming in, who may face some barriers or some systemic disadvantage to being successful at our universities. And so, we're, I think, particularly hopeful that some of the things we're going to talk about today are going to help us inch a little further into closing these types of equity gaps.
And pretty much everything we talk about has had at least some studies showing that they have been effective in narrowing some of these gaps.
Yeah, and we'll share the resources on that at the end of the presentation.
And so one thing that's important is, instructional designers refer to it as a community of inquiry approach, but in general, a sense of belonging, a sense of community is really important. And this is true in any type of modality. And one of those is building connections between instructors and students.
And, so that sense of community and belonging is one of the first things that we can do as faculty in creating a space where we can communicate to all of our students that we want them to be successful and that they can be successful and that we're here to support them in that. So some of the things we can do specifically to help this are to really take some time to learn names of our students. And so in this way, we're trying to humanize ourselves and our students by taking that moment to learn their names, to learn how to pronounce their names, use their preferred pronouns if they offer them to us, and it doesn't necessarily have to be that we're memorizing all 300 of our students' names. There are tools that we can use, like name tents and printing out rosters with our students' pictures and names, so that we can better facilitate communicating with our students.
And there are some nice applications available, some of which are web-based, some of which are, well, they're all web-based, actually. Let me take that back. But you can have students record their names and put in a document so that everyone can learn how to pronounce each other's names. You could also use something like VoiceThread or some other application, or Flip, for example, where you have students introduce themselves and state their name there. And practicing that can be useful. And actually, Michelle Miller has a book that's going to be coming out late this summer, it's expected at least, on some strategies that are based on cognitive science about how we can learn names more effectively. She gave a workshop at the POD conference a couple of months ago. And it's going to be a short book, but it's going to be a useful one, because in general, people have trouble remembering names, especially with large numbers of names. But there are some things that we can do to help make those connections to make it easier to remember names. Another simple thing to do is, in terms of classes, is get there before the class. Don't come in right at the second when class is supposed to start, both because you probably have some things you have to set up, and one of the things that students are troubled by is when the instructor is up there fumbling and not being ready at the start of the class while they're waiting for class to begin. But if you arrive early, chat with students, talk to some of the students and so forth, and make those types of connections. Staying late, because students will often want to come up and ask some questions at the end. That can, don't stay so late that the next instructor can't get in and set up for their class. I've had that issue with the tools I use in my large class in particular, it often takes about 15 minutes to set up the iClicker software and do all the multi-factor authentication and set up Zoom and set up the recording software, or not the recording software, a number of software tools that I use in class, opening up Brightspace and other things. And getting all that set up can take a little bit of time.
And I think also just the timing and making sure you are there early, and that you end class on time, but you give your students some time maybe after class or in office hours to support them in whatever ways they need, also shows that you respect their time, and that you can set that expectation for yourself as well, for your students to respect that class time and to use it most effectively.
And when you're doing things in class, you don't have to stay in the front of the room. That sets up that hierarchical structure. Wander around, chat with students. If they're engaged in some activity, see how it's going. Offer to assist them if they need any help. But just meet with them a bit more informally and reduce some of that power difference. And another really good thing to do is to do a survey of your students. It could be a discussion board, it could be some type of a Google form or something similar, but get to know the students, ask them about some of the things they're interested in, and get to know a little bit more about the background, because you can often use that to make some connections, so that if, for example, you find that there are some people in your class who enjoy a particular type of music, you could use some references to that. If there's some people who are planning to become, let's say if they're planning to become musicians, you might want to put more music examples. If there are students who are people returning to school, who are raising families and so forth, you could include more examples relevant to that. But the more you know about the students, the more types of connections you can build into the class in terms of the examples you use and so forth.
Yeah, and it can be just much more motivating for students when they can find that common interest in the classroom and connect all of that. And finally, let your students know how you're available to assist them. So maybe this is talking a little bit about the purpose and the technical details of holding office hours, really just encouraging them, pointing them to other resources that might be available around campus to support them, whether it's tutoring or maybe it's, other types of support. But by communicating to them that you're there to help them be successful and to support each of them in this class, really sets a strong tone of support and building that close-knit community.
And also let students know what office hours are, or maybe even change the name. A number of people who were first-gen students have noted, Tony Jacks, for example, in his book about a year and a half, 2 years ago, noted that when he first went to college at Harvard, actually, he had no idea what office hours were. That as far when he first heard about it, he thought those were the times when you shouldn't bother faculty members because they were busy. Many people rename this as student hours or something similar, or student assistant hours. And you may also want to think about perhaps doing it in some location which is a little more friendly than your office, because students up through the point when they enter college, when they're asked to see someone in their office, it's usually a bad thing. It's usually
Sure.
because they're in some type of trouble. Letting them know what the purpose of these office hours are, and encouraging them to stop by is helpful. So we want to build a community not just between us and our students. We also want students to make connections in class, because the more connections students form with each other, the more likely it is that they'll be successful, they'll be engaged, and they'll persist. Because we have so many students coming into our institutions, taking out often quite a large amount of debt, and then leaving without a degree, and they end up in worse financial positions than if they hadn't even entered. And the more we can help students persist and make it through, the better off they are.
So some of the things you can do is to really make space and create learning activities that are collaborative in nature among your students, team-based learning activities, and to think about how those, whether you're doing some kind of small group discussion or some kind of problem solving activity, to think about how you are sorting those students into those groups, because students tend to sit near students who look like them, who they tend to gravitate to students who come from similar backgrounds as they do, and it might create a disbalance or unbalance rather in those groups. And so by using some kind of neutral criteria, having students count off, or some other technique, you can create a more balanced experience for students.
One of the things I do when I have persistent groups in my econometrics class or in a capstone course is, because those classes do quite a bit with statistical work and mathematical tools, I ask students how many math courses they've had up to that point. And I just sort them that way, and then go down the list from highest to lowest to make sure that the people with the most math are evenly spread across all the groups, and people with the least are evenly spread. Because what will normally happen is students will ask if they can, especially in upper level classes in a major where people have often taken many classes together, they'll ask if they can form their own groups. And what I'll normally say to them is, well, how do you know each other? You say, well, we've taken a lot of classes together. I said, well, if the people who've taken a lot of classes together have had more courses of this type, those groups are going to be perhaps a little bit unbalanced. And you're going to have these groups where some people know each other, they have stronger backgrounds, and other groups where people have never met each other and they don't have that sort of background. And an interesting side of, and generally when students see it that way, they agree that doing some other criteria is useful. And one thing that has struck me is that ever since I started doing this several years back now, the groups tend to be much more focused. There's less side conversations because the groups were created just for the purpose of working on these tasks in class. And they tend to be much more task focused than if groups of friends were getting together and getting a bit off track.
Providing students with multiple means of expression. So this can help students, they can play to some of their strengths if, for instance, I have assigned assignments, such as the unessay, to give students a lot of autonomy in demonstrating their learning, and it's really changed. I think it's really helped create a lot of motivation and encouragement for students, and they get to share with their classmates, more about things that are meaningful to them.
And this is one of those principles from UDL that,
Mhm.
you know, UDL is more than this. There's also multiple means of representation, multiple means of engagement, but this does seem to work pretty well in that everyone tends to feel more a part of the group if they get to demonstrate their knowledge in a way that's more comfortable with them. Some students are not very comfortable writing, for example, but recording videos might become much more comfortable. And if you let students express themselves in ways that they feel they're able to do it more strongly, it can often work pretty well. And that was especially important when people were working remotely, because some students were doing all their coursework on their phones. And it's
Mhm.
really hard to write a paper on a phone, although many students had to
Yeah,
try to
yeah,
do that.
for sure.
But it's pretty easy to create a video and upload it on your phone. So, you know, in general, it's not, if it aligns with your course objectives,
Mhm.
giving students options to doing it can work pretty well.
Yeah.
Peer instruction in general is also a really helpful way of helping students get to know each other, and it tends to increase learning, and it benefits everyone. If you have groups where some people or some students who are really strong and have a strong background in the
Mhm.
subject and others that have a weaker background, the students with a stronger background benefit by retrieving that information and explaining it to other people. Because I think, as we've all found out when we've been teaching, that when we try to the first time we try to explain things to our students that we thought we understood pretty well, it tends to deepen our understanding, and we get much higher. We end up becoming much more automatic responses. We we learn this stuff much more deeply when we have to teach it to other
Yeah,
people in general, and that works for students too. And
yeah.
there's been lots of studies of this. There was one big study that convinced me of this about 12 years ago, where a class was using, I think it was a biology class, was using undergraduate TAs and graduate TAs, and they measured the performance of students using a pre-test in biology and a post-test at the end of the term. And what they found was that the students who work with undergraduate TAs had the largest gain in performance compared to those that work with graduate students. But of the students who were students in the class, but the undergraduate TAs actually had the largest gain in
Mm.
understanding. So, you know, all the students benefited, but the same thing is true without having formal TAs,
Yep.
that explaining things to other people reinforces it, and other students are able to explain things in terms that connects with students often better than we do. It's something that's
Yep.
been called the curse of knowledge by Carl Weinman and other people.
Mhm.
That, you know, when you really understand things well, it's hard often to see where people are having trouble making the
Mhm.
connections. But if you're working with other people who've recently learned it, that tends to be really helpful.
Yeah. Anecdotally, I didn't understand statistics, I feel like, until I taught it. And then, and so I think, we've all had some kind of experience related to this at some point in time, that when we do teach, we tend to know it. So it makes sense to leverage that in the classroom. Encouraging students to get to know each other, and really just, what we've been talking about the last two slides on building this community. The goal here is to get them comfortable so that they can take risks in the classroom, and they don't feel like they're on the spot, or that everybody is judging them, because when they build those relationships, those trusting relationships with you as your faculty member, with their peers, they can offer up their thoughts about the content, and they can ask questions and feel supported in all of that. So having them get to know each other, whether it's encouraging them to talk to each other during class, to engage in icebreakers, there's really a lot of opportunities, I think, throughout the semester, not just at the very beginning of the semester, but importantly at the beginning of the semester, to set the tone, to have students work together in the course. And it's really something that they need to learn for their future careers, because we are all working very collaboratively in all of our careers. I think most careers are fairly collaborative in nature to some extent, and giving them the skills to do that and the practice to do that in the classroom is something they'll carry with them.
And if either of you want to say something, just jump in. You can type
Jump
it in
on
chat or
in.
just say
Yeah.
something. And when you do have discussions, try to use inclusive discussion strategies. There's a lot we could talk about that, but we only have this time slot. But some people are really uncomfortable speaking in large groups, that if they're in a class of 30 or 40 students, many students might be perhaps not feeling well. Many students may not be that confident of their knowledge. They may be a bit introverted, but there's a lot of things you can do to ease that. One is think, pair, share activities, where you have people think about things and then talk about it with one other person. It's much less intimidating to talk to someone next to you than it is to speak in front of a class. That's especially true if you have a class of 300 or 400 students. And then you could ask them, and then ask students, especially if it's a small group or in a large group, randomly ask students to report on what the group talked about. And when students are not stating their own thoughts, but they're describing a discussion between two people, there's much less risk being felt there, that they're explaining what the other person was saying or what they both were saying without tying it to their own identity in some way. And that can ease some of the pressure. But giving students multiple ways of being engaged in discussions can be really useful. And one thing that we've learned from online teaching is that discussion boards can be actually very comfortable for many people in discussing, because a lot of people in class will have a mix of people who want to just state something, sometimes without thinking about it, while there's other students who really want to process things and will only be willing to say something after they've had some time. One possibility is give them more time to think before you actually call on anyone. Another strategy that people have used in in-person discussions is to say that you're not going to call on anyone until you see at least 3 hands up or 5 hands up or something similar. So that way it encourages more people to participate, and you're not only hearing from the same people. There's other things you could do where you could use random calling on people. There's some mixed results on that. That's often seen to be intimidating for students at first, but if you do it regularly, that the risk with that seems to go down a bit, and people become accustomed. If you've already created a safe environment where people feel comfortable in the class.
So beyond some of those techniques, we've also talked a bit about assigning responsibilities within those small discussion groups, so that students who as John mentioned, they might feel more comfortable speaking in front of the class, or they might want to record things, but also ensuring that we rotate the responsibilities in that, because it does tend to be a fairly gendered experience, that women tend to be relegated or tend to do more feminized work in those discussion groups, like recording, the notes, taking notes for the group. And, there's also, and I think John can probably speak to some more details of this, there's some research that suggests we should, encourage more female dominated groups, and that it can really...
That goes back to that earlier point about group formation. There was a study done by a few economists actually at Brigham Young University in the graduate program, where what happens is they have persistent groups where students work together for the entire year. And what they analyzed the actual discussion of the groups, and also they had people rate each other in terms of the extent of participation, rate themselves and the other members of the group. And what they found in that study, it was published about 1.5 years or so ago. What they found in that, we had a podcast with one of the participants in that. What they found basically was that women in groups where there are a minority of females in groups tend to be rated by other people in the group, male and female, as being less engaged in the group's activities or discussions, but the individuals themselves rated their participation lower. But that was, and in fact, when they were actually recording the interactions and so forth, this was, an IRB approved study, so they were able to record things and identify the speakers during some of the discussions. They found that in female majority groups, that broke down, that women rated themselves higher with female majority groups, but they rated themselves and other people rated them much lower when they were in the minority in the group. For males, it didn't make any difference. They rated themselves and each other relatively high, whether they were in the majority or the minority. So when you form groups, that one argument might be to try to group at least for females based on that one study at least. Grouping them in groups where they are a majority of the participants in the group.
Yeah, something to consider.
Maybe worth considering at least. Yeah.
Yeah.
So small groups we've talked about, and rotating. Okay. And making sure that the participation is balanced. And again, that's where random calling could work and so forth.
Sure.
And this is one that's come up in a lot of workshops, including one earlier today.
Yeah, so, again, using inclusive examples. So maybe that's tying, thinking about how your examples are representative of all of your students' experiences, or, varied student experiences, so that, our students can see themselves in these examples, and they can make stronger connections from their own lives to things that you're talking about in class. Also, this might mean, diversifying your course materials, so that that's coming up here. So, thinking, really about incorporating an array of perspectives in your course.
Yeah, if you're going to talk about sports, you might not want to talk about dressage or talk about curling, for example, because that may not relate very well with the students we generally work with. But using examples that are not all from one group can be really helpful, and provide multiple voices in those discussions. Another is avoid practices that generate stereotype threat. And there's been quite a few studies, many done by Claude Steele, but some later on. They came up actually in our last workshop. And in general, what the early studies in particular have found is that when students were reminded of their race or their gender or some other factor that has been in the past tied to lower performance or lower rates of success, it tends to result in lower success rates. The first study on this was one where a group of Asian females were given a math exam, and they were divided into 3 groups. The exams were identical, but the initial prompt at the beginning was just slightly different. One group was asked, I think this was at Harvard back in the time when they had single-sex dorms, and the question asked which dorm they lived in. Now, they were all female students, but some of them were reminded that they were living in single-sex dorms. And again, they were all Asian females in that particular study. Some of them were asked to list, a third of them roughly were asked to list their ethnicity, and the third group was given a more neutral prompt. And what they found is that what the study found, that initial study found, was that students who were reminded that they were female had the lower scores. The students who were reminded that they were Asian had the highest scores, and the other group were somewhere in between those. And they've also found similar results in some studies with race. That result actually hasn't held up quite as well in more recent studies, and it seems to vary from campus to campus. And so it's one of those things where, there's some question about the persistence of the stereotype threat. It seems to vary. It may vary by income. It may vary by other factors. But there is at least fairly strong evidence of the persistence of stereotype threat.
And it's good practice to avoid it, anyway. And, things like equity walks, where students are sort of forced to disclose parts of their identity that, might be challenging for them to make public, and it could also reinforce the sort of stereotype threat, like they may not belong on campus or in a college setting.
And I think they mostly disappeared, but they were popular like 10 or 15 years ago. And we had someone in a workshop actually said, well, they do that. And then the question came up with whether it's very good. The way they work is you have all your students line up on a line somewhere in a big hall or gym or something similar. And then you ask people to step forward or backwards, depending on what characteristics they have. So that those things that tended to increase success cause people to walk forward. Those things that tended to not do that tended to cause people to move back. And it was very much signaling this type of stereotype threat.
So, as I sort of mentioned before, kind of diversifying the resources that you use in your courses. So textbooks and readings to overall, try to decolonize your curriculum, to really think about, whose voices are being represented in your courses. And to engage in discussions with students about why there may be less representation in your field, and to talk about how you might try to alleviate that, and to really center those voices in your syllabi and in your courses. And I think we've talked a little bit about this, right? To allow students to see themselves in examples in class, and to make the connections from their own experiences, or where they see themselves in the future, or their future careers. This can help really increase their motivation. It can help them, find relevancy in your course, to their own lives, and to their future endeavors.
Yeah, and basically, instead of just having them view other people's experiences, have them reflect on their own life. So that way they get to feel more a part of the discussion, and that they get to bring in their experiences into the discussion, which again is a good way of building community and so on. Another thing that is fairly important, or at least many studies have shown, is a growth mindset. And basically, a growth mindset is one where you think that where people believe that they can become better at tasks when they work at it. That basically skills can be acquired, and if they're not doing well, they can do better. A fixed mindset is one where people think they either are able to do something or they're not. And we all have growth mindsets in some areas and fixed mindsets in others. The research suggests, though, that in terms of academic skills, or at least some research suggests, that people with a growth mindset tend to be more successful. People with a fixed mindset, whether they were successful or not in earlier parts of their education, tend not to be quite as successful, because if you had always been successful in high school, say, and you suddenly get to college and you're not doing that well, it makes you question whether you really are that high ability person that you thought you were, and many people just give up. But if, for those students who have a growth mindset, they recognize that they can become better. And there are various ways you can perhaps encourage this. And one way is remind them of cases where they've had a growth mindset, or where they've experienced that growth. You can talk about what happened the first time they tried riding a bicycle, and then what happened after they practiced that, or when they played a sport, and how did they become better at it in similar ways. But we all have some areas. Some people will say, I'm not a math person, or I'm not a creative person, or something similar, and encourage them, well, you're not yet. And just remind them that maybe they don't know that much about this subject now, but by the end of the term, they will.
Yeah. Giving them opportunities to make mistakes in classrooms without severe penalty to your grades. So maybe that means including some low stakes assessment, and some or no stakes assessment, and really giving and communicating to students that this is for them to master this content, and that they can, and I often use it in class. I give low stakes quizzes that they can retake over and over again, an unlimited amount of times in a week that it's assigned, and really focusing on the learning gains that I hope them to achieve in that.
And as Maggie said, normalizing mistakes as part of learning is really helpful to build that. And the phrase that's been used for that is to fail forward. That each time you make a mistake, you learn from it, and you're more likely to remember those things in the future, in at least some studies. And if, when relevant, disclosing some of the challenges you face, that if you experience some trouble in a course, just talking about that, but letting them know that you still ended up being successful, despite the fact that you may have had some trouble in one of the courses that you took in college or somewhere along the way.
And that does a lot to humanize yourself to students, and to, remind them that, you're not just this kind of all-knowing, figure of authority in the classroom, but that you're just as human as they are, and can identify with their struggles too. Opportunities for revision. So, if you have any kind of assignments, right? But especially some of those higher stakes assignments, maybe writing assignments where you give students some opportunity to increase their performance by incorporating feedback and revising their work. That's certainly one way to keep that growth mindset at the center of your course.
Yeah, some course design can make a big difference here. Giving students the chance to try something and fail is extremely important in reducing some of these equity gaps, because our students come in with very different backgrounds. Some went to schools where there was a lot of college prep courses and they were well prepared for our courses. Others went to schools where the math curriculum, where the reading work, where the critical thinking skills were not quite as highly developed. But we want to make sure that students have the opportunity to make some mistakes and learn from those mistakes, because it's really easy for people to give up, especially if they're facing stereotype threat and other barriers. And Angela Bauer is a chemistry professor, actually the chair of the chemistry department now at High Point, but she had worked in Green Bay, and she's done a lot of work on growth mindset interventions. In Green Bay, she worked with some essentially remedial classes for students who came in with weaker background, and they essentially eliminated, they were optional, but a large proportion of the students who were struggling attended those, and it reduced some of the gaps that were occurring in terms of performance. But that didn't work when she tried it at High Point. But what she did actually is she created just one slide that she distributed to everyone teaching for each day's class, at Green Bay in the introductory chemistry class, that just contains some example of some chemists out there who had struggled at some point but then became successful. They were just one little short introduction to a growth mindset, an example of growth mindset at work that was introduced in every class, and the racial and first gen achievement gaps or equity gaps completely disappeared in at least that one experiment. So, encouraging people to adopt a growth mindset can be effective, but it's really important that we give students that opportunity to make mistakes, because telling students to have a growth mindset and then giving them an exam where if they fail at, in the first third of the semester, means that their highest possible grade is going to be a C- is not necessarily very motivating. There was a study done, though, also about 2 years ago now, by Elizabeth Canning and some other people. She's a psychologist who's done some really great research on teaching and learning. And what she looked at, or what this group of researchers looked at, was the effective faculty mindset. An instrument was given to faculty in STEM fields, and asking them whether they believed in essentially a growth mindset or not. And it turned out that faculty mindset was more important than student mindset in terms of student performance. And what happened is that for the faculty members who had a fixed mindset, who believed that students either were able to do this or not, their students on average did worse across the board in any standardized tests that they were given, or end of term finals and so forth. But what happened was that when instructors had a growth mindset, when they believed that students can become better by working on things, it raised all students' performance, but it especially raised the performance of those students who were most at risk. So that was a really interesting study, and it was a fairly large sample. It was in a large institution with lots of instructors and lots of students. And this is something that's come up a lot, so we don't want to belabor this because we've talked about this in multiple other workshops. But in general, pretty much all evidence-based teaching strategies benefit all students, but they especially benefit the students who are most at risk. And I think we've talked about this quite a bit.
Yeah, and we've done a lot of reading groups, that have really emphasized these topics too. But really creating the time and space for your students to practice a lot of the content you want them to learn is vital.
And we have lots of references on this, or a number of references on this,
Mhm.
showing the effect and so on.
Yeah.
And also metacognitive reflection is also important, or it seems to be helpful. And some ways we can incorporate, one way of incorporating that is to do some type of adaptive learning, personalized learning, or mastery learning. Adaptive learning platforms are generally AI-based, where essentially they test students on what they know on some portion of the course, and then they create a customized learning path for the students based on how well they do at various parts. And if they're struggling with things, it gives them some lower level information, some lower level knowledge tasks, and then tests them on that. And basically, students focus their time on the things they are weakest at, and they don't spend that much time on the things that they are already more skilled at. And it, in some introductory classes, particularly in the STEM fields, that can be really helpful. Personalized learning is a name that Lumen Learning uses with their Waymaker package, which we have in many disciplines available for free. It's a similar type of approach, except the students choose which areas to focus on, but it gives them some visual cues. What that initial test does is it shows them where they need to work on more and where they don't, and they work in different blocks in each course module. And once they've mastered the material, that block turns green. It starts off with red, then it turns yellow when they're showing some increased proficiency, and then it changes color once they've established mastery, and then they can work on other blocks. Mastery learning systems quizzes are basically the same type of thing that instructors put together. As Maggie said, repeated testing with unlimited attempts and so forth, with low stakes assessment can be helpful.
Yeah. So, the next slide, and we could have an entire session on this, but essentially, when students are distracted because their basic needs are not being met, that can make that can be very impactful on their learning. And so really trying to think about structuring your course so that you have low to no costs for your materials, or to utilize inclusive access so that students who are waiting for financial aid and vouchers to purchase their textbooks are not left behind in the very beginning of class as they wait for access to that material, can be really helpful in ensuring their success for the rest of the semester. And we have some excellent resources on campus. We have Shop, which is a food pantry and a clothing pantry for students. The Counseling Center, the Dean of Students Office, all of them have some important resources that we can put in our syllabi and point students to and it's really important, I think, to even just mention it without any prompts, so students don't have to disclose to you that they might be needing some of these resources. So really putting it out there for students day one is important.
Because not all students are aware of this, and it also shows that you care about the students' well-being, which is, again, an important part of building that community. Another thing that's been shown to be really important is building more structure in your courses, such as scaffolding assignments, providing feedback at each stage, clear and complete instructions, such as a tilt approach, for example, and providing exemplars of high quality work and some less acceptable work, but providing a variety of exemplars so that students can see there's more than one way to demonstrate their knowledge. And the tilt approach, which we do have a couple of workshops on. So we've got those recorded. In general,
active learning is also important for increasing engagement and learning for all of our students. So ensuring that they're not just passively sitting in the classroom and not using that class time to connect their experiences and their knowledge to new contexts. I just lost where that whole sentence was going, so I don't know how to finish it. But generally, active learning has been an important aspect for.
There have been lots of large-scale meta-analyses that have been done that show that students learn more with active learning than when the instructor primarily uses lecture as a way of conveying information. But another thing, and those gains from that, in every study that I've seen, and been a lot of them, are largest again for the students who are first-gen students, Pell eligible students, and students from historically minoritized groups. But one thing we should be aware is that students are resistant to this because it doesn't feel as good, because active learning techniques generally involve students trying to grapple with problems without necessarily just sitting there listening to an instructor. It's really easy to sit in a class and listen to a lecture and think you understand it. But when you're working on active learning activities, some of the gaps in your knowledge become more apparent and it doesn't feel as good. And students will often say in course evaluations or in comments to you that, you're making me learn this material myself, you're not teaching. And in general, that's not it. You have to build a case for why you're doing this, and showing them the research can be really helpful in convincing them. Now, I was hoping we'd have like more time for this, but we do have a lot of resources here on each of the main themes, on each of the main topic. Here are some of the studies about equity gaps, how large it is, and so forth. Here's one podcast on it. This was, by the way, an interesting podcast we did with Chuck Zubin and Harris Rosen about a program where Harris Rosen has funded students in going to college. Yeah. But if you notice, if you open up the thing at the side, you can jump to it. We have some podcasts that Rebecca Mastera and I do have addressed all of these topics, but we also have some studies on all this. So Jennifer, you had a couple of questions. So sorry about that.
Yes, thank you for this detailed workshop that you put together. I really appreciate your time. I have been doing grade audits since I began teaching about 13 years ago at each stage of assessment, participation, written assignments, oral assignments, because as we know as educators, people according to their social location tend to perform better in some areas than in others. And I had similar demographics by race, gender, and first-gen status at my previous institution as I do now here at SUNY Oswego. The grade audits at my previous institution showed that students from historically oppressed communities performed in similar ways to students from historically dominant communities. And I use the vast majority of the strategies that you identified in the workshop, like I remember everyone's name on the first day of class, I create team-based and peer-to-peer learning, inclusive examples, etc. So I was really motivated to attend this workshop because my grade audits at Oswego demonstrate, the reproduction of structural inequality in the distribution of grades. And despite all of these tactics, it's still happening, and I don't know how to address that. So I was hoping to walk away with a couple ideas as to how to begin to pilot some new strategies to address that.
Yeah, just a few issues here. One is, we can do only so much in our classes to equalize differences that students have been exposed to in their environments in the school district and all their past education. And there are some really dramatic inequities in terms of the quality of education that students come in with. But one approach that many people have been moving to is some form of alternative grading that essentially removes some of those effects. One simple thing some people have done, and it's controversial, is look at the amount of learning progress, using an ungrading approach, for example, to see how far students were able to go from where they came in to where they went. There's contract-based grading system, there's labor-based grading systems, and some of those things will reduce some of those inequities in terms of the grades that students receive at the end of the term. But it is different. It is difficult to not have some of those things show up in the grading. And basically, I think all these strategies have been shown to reduce those inequities in terms of outcome, but very few of them have been completely effective in eliminating them all the time in all classes, but they can make them smaller. And having those types of audits is one thing that colleges have been doing more and more. And it's really easy for faculty to ignore those things without that data. And I'm hoping we will start releasing that more generally so that faculty can observe the breakdown in outcomes by Pell eligible status, by race, and so forth, because if we're not aware of that distribution, it's really
Yeah.
hard to even make adjustments because it's kind of invisible in the absence of those audits. But
Sure.
there's no one universal strategy that works all the
Mhm.
time in all classes.
One thing I might suggest is, we did put out a call for open classrooms, and so it might be useful, might be interesting to invite some of our faculty peers to join in on the class and see, what's going on. They might be able to share some experiences that they've had, or they might be able to see things that might provide some insight on some of the things that you're talking about. Really, and that's a formative assessment. It's not meant to be evaluative, it's not something, to be used for like a tenure and promotion thing, but to really kind of create that community across faculty to, because I'm sure that, there are probably many faculty who are struggling with the same, issues, or, trying to, experiment in different ways that might be helpful. So, something like that might be helpful to consider.
And the more scaffolding, the more support you can provide for students who come in with a weaker background in the tools that students need, the better. But that does mean, and this is a bit of an inequity, that the students who come in with weaker preparation have to do more work to be successful in the course than those students that come in with more and stronger prior knowledge. But letting them know that explicitly, that there's some things they're going to be good at, there's others they're going to have to work at, but let them know that work on that material is important, and make sure that they have resources that will help them do that. And there's a lot of resources out there that you can share. One thing that we've been suggesting a lot recently is using AI tools to give students more practice questions. Ask them, for the things they're not that comfortable with, ask them to do more retrieval practice by asking ChatGPT or another tool to generate a series of questions and give them feedback on their responses. Or, if they're having trouble reading some of the papers or work assigned, asking ChatGPT, entering it basically, and then asking it to generate a summary can be useful. But we've all faced that challenge, and being aware of it is a first step, and working to try different things, and looking at the results and seeing how they change and trying alternative approaches can be helpful. And with the open classrooms, not just having people observe your class, but maybe observe other classes too, to see what other people are doing and see if that might be helpful. So that was one question. You mentioned two.
Yes, thank you both for your recommendations. The second question is about stereotype threat, and it had me thinking about how Paul is also in sociology. In sociology, we often talk about racial inequality, gender inequality, class inequality, and how that might be impacting students in the classroom to sort of set them up for feeling like they might not be successful, because we talk about, being subject to poverty or being subject to illness because of racialization practices and whatnot. So I'm wondering if y'all have some thoughts or recommendations on how to approach that in a class that heavily is about those topics.
One in an introductory economics course that comes up all the time as well. But to the extent to which we can let people know that it's not something unique to them, that this is due to historical circumstances, due to housing, segregation, due to government policies that led to increased housing segregation, due to locally funded public schools, due to various types of inequity in society, resources that they received leading up to here were not always at the same level as resources for people from higher income families. And that's not their fault, but they do need to, bridge that gap that that society has imposed on them. Paul, do you have a better response?
No, not a better response, but I think we're a little bit lucky in sociology too, because I think one of the useful tools, we do all the institutional structural kind of work to lay that groundwork. But then we have ethnographies that allow people to be showcased in their agency, even in these sort of difficult conditions. And I think, I suspect that that's a really useful tool in many ways, or at least I suspect it is. I haven't tested that out. because it showcases people having dignity and capabilities even under these difficult circumstances. So I think that's useful for our discipline, at least. I don't know if that's
And that
accessible.
can help overcome stereotype threat and help build that growth mindset. And the more examples of that you can build in, I think the better it would be.
And I might also, not to jump, back too much, but on, troubleshooting some of those inequity gaps or those equity gaps, you might want to think about like an exit ticket too, just really like spend time checking in on where those gaps are for students, or, what, where they've identified that they're still struggling with. And that way you can kind of refocus some content and in incorporating some time in your semester for like, troubleshooting some of those questions that remain. Because I think we tend to, try to fit in as much material as possible in 15 weeks, and then we don't leave any time to like, actually dive deeper into things that might need that attention before students move forward. Paul, go for it.
Yes, that's prefigures my question. So I love the presentation. Thank you so much. It's always stimulating. I'm doing a lot of these things, but I'm going to pick up some new tricks. One of the success stories from last semester for me had been using a different technique for keeping students accountable for the readings, whereby I had them write little summaries and then interact with them at the beginning of class. And I did that through one of the workshops at the beginning of the semester. And it was great because I had been using a technique where I randomly called on 3 students to tell me something, softball questions about the readings. And that wasn't as effective as this at all. So I've been really thrilled with this new sort of trick, this new technique. But I'm also considering, I haven't decided yet. And this is the question here. I'm teaching a crisis in American democracy. And there's a really great simulated society exercise. It's a whole like thing where students break into groups and they simulate a society, but it takes a little bit of time. It's got so many payoffs, but I've got to balance that with content and other kinds of considerations. I'm wondering, are there any examples of edges where you've had to sort of like tweak or balance one good relative to another?
All the time.
Yeah,
And in fact, in history, that approach is called the uncovering approach. That, historians were focused on covering this whole period of history, but what the uncoverage approach does is it suggests that students ended up with a really superficial understanding of bits and pieces here and there without really ever learning the methodology of the discipline, without really ever having engaged in the practice of discipline. And so what they've suggested is trimming back the content and letting people dive deeper is a good way of doing that, because if they learn how to do history, they're going to be able to understand history in later courses much more effectively than if it's a slight overview of all the topics. And that's something in economics I've had to make changes, because the books I used to use 5 or 6 years ago would not work with the students we have today, especially since COVID, but even before that. Our students are not, the students we have is a much more diverse mix of students, but they're coming in with weaker skills in graph and math and so forth. And the books I had just were going right by a lot of students. So I'm using a Waymaker personalized learning approach because it builds those skills in and it lets students practice things. It has interactive graphs and other things, but trimming back coverage and going in more depth is something that I think can be really helpful in keeping as many students from getting lost. And if you can design assignments, and this may affect what Jennifer was suggesting too, was raising too, is that if you can have students work on projects at different levels that are appropriate to their background and their strength, so that the students who come in with a weaker background can work on developing their understanding at a level that works for them, while students who already have a stronger one, you could nudge and have them push a little bit further, in terms of their individual projects. And one other thing I was going to suggest is in terms of reading, one thing that I found to be, and I think Maggie too, is using hypothesis with readings, where students are asked to do a discussion in the reading before they're discussed in class, or even a quiz, having them go through a quiz on Brightspace or something before they discuss it in class is a good way, or polling even, is a good way of making sure that students do the reading. And, the students who came from really strong schools, who have a strong strong background and have been successful tend to do that work automatically. The students from schools where they weren't pressed quite as hard to learn, where they were not expected to go to college, have not generally been encouraged to do that type of thing, and making sure that those are the students who need the most work on this material. And it's a bit of a challenge because they're going to face more difficulties working through some of it, but that's really essential for them to be successful. So,
Thank you.
you know, again,
Thank you.
there's
Thank you.
no easy solutions.
Yeah.
We're all facing these challenges. Group work
Thank
can
you
help
both.
too.
I know we're at time, I believe. Is that right?
Yeah, but again, I don't have anything to do right now, so if you know,
If
I'm
you have
happy
another
to stay.
question, go for it. Yeah.
I don't know if this is your role in CELT, for example, either of you, but do either of you have time to sit down with faculty and go over particular issues one-on-one? Is that something that
Sure.
you're able to do?
Absolutely.
Sure. We do that
Amazing.
pretty often, not as often as we'd like to, but yes.
Yeah, we'd be happy to.
Great, thank you.
Any other thoughts or suggestions or practices that have worked, or other questions you have before we end that?
One thing I'm playing with this semester is, and I'm not sure it's going to end up being totally a total solution, but I had a lot of I had an online class and I had a lot of students who weren't completing the assignments, and I really worked hard to get them back into doing just discussion boards, engagement, that kind of stuff. And then with the end of the semester, I had some students who didn't complete the work and they just weren't going to pass. So I issued a bunch of incompletes as opposed to just failing them. And so they're kind of trickling in now. And I put I don't know if that's going to be a terribly effective strategy, but I do wonder what is your thought about the online modality? It seems to me that is very difficult with students who come from disadvantaged backgrounds. It just creates increase sort of a bifurcation in my experience. Has that been your experience as well?
It can. Some of those gaps have disappeared. That they were really prominent back in the early days of online instruction. But in general, online courses have higher drop, fail, and withdrawal rates. That students are more likely to ghost an online class than they are a face-to-face class. But in my large intro class, I lose quite a few students for the same reason. And I got 300 to 400 students often in those classes. You know, there's going to be a good proportion, 10 or 15%, who just stop doing much of the work, or at least enough of the work to get a C or better in the course, because they just skip things. One thing that I've been doing that has reduced that a little bit is using the Brightspace reminders, or the intelligent agents. Because what you can do there is you could, a few days before an assignment is due, you can have it trigger an email that goes to students saying, this is a reminder that this is due in 24 hours or 36 hours or due at this date. And that goes to their email, typically, at least unless they blocked it, or unless they haven't updated their email and they came from another SUNY school. That's another problem. But in any case, they should get an email that reminds them of when things are due, and sometimes that will help nudge them. And then you can also send emails out of people doing poorly, encouraging them to come in during their office hours, or reminding them that that they need to complete these things if they're going to pass the course. It doesn't always work. I had probably 7 or 8 students right at the end of the term saying, I know I haven't done all this work, but, and then I look at their grade and they had only done like 10 or 15% of the assignments in the class. I said, well, there's not really much you can do in the next 2 days to learn a whole class worth of material. In the future, use this as a learning experience. In the future, make sure that you stay up with the course. And if you're having problems, address them early, because it's, I'm concerned, I don't give a lot of incompletes, but mostly because some of it's because of the scale. But in some cases, it may be better for students to start over. It can lead to more problems, but in some cases, it's better to start over fresh than it is to start the next semester with a lot of work remaining from the previous one. So it's a challenge.
Yeah, it is.
But the intelligent agents can be really helpful in just nudging students a little bit.
Great.
And each semester I've been adding more of them with more activities and more triggers. Any
Great.
other thoughts or questions or?
None at the moment, but thank you for the presentation. It's always, like I said, it's always stimulating. It's always encouraging. I get new sort of ideas about how to develop new approaches. As always, the challenge is balancing.
Yeah, there's always trade-offs. It's one of the things economists talk about all the time, but certainly in this case, it's true. Between, you know, if racing through material doesn't help if students don't learn it, you know.
Right.
Okay,
I'm
well, thank you.
a little bit. I have to go do some.
Okay,
pickup.
so we'll stop. But if you have any questions at any time or just want to stop by and chat, usually I'm